Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Substack Live. I'm Dave Keating from the Gulfstream Blues Substack, and today I'm very fortunate to be joined by Julien Hoez, who is from the French Dispatch Substack, a Substack I really, really enjoy. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Thanks so much, Julien, for joining me today.
No, thanks for the invitation. I'm looking forward to this too, and we're gonna have a fun chat, I think.
Yeah, what Julian does great is break down the French place in the world in English, which is really key, I think, in a way that I think sometimes domestic coverage in France can kind of miss. Julian does a great job with particularly examining France's place in Europe, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So, Julian, I wanted to first ask you about this summit that took place yesterday in Paris. So this was the kind of NATO -3 summit for format, I'm calling it. So this was all of the NATO members except for the United States, Hungary, and Slovakia, plus a couple others. So Ireland and Cyprus were there. They're not in NATO, and Australia was there, not in NATO for geographic reasons, obviously. Interesting, those three additions kind of make up for the missing three. So if you looked at the number of participating countries, you might think it was NATO at 32.
Hmm.
But of course, it's not NATO. This is, by my counts, the fourth of these ad hoc Coalition of the Willing summits, or fifth, I guess, if you count the
Yeah.
two that first week when the people were mad that they weren't invited, so Macron had to have a second one. How would you say yesterday's summit went? And at the end of it, we had President Macron speaking to the press saying that basically this format the British and French leadership of this format was recognized by all the participants. Is that a success? Is that even true? How do you assess yesterday?
So, I mean, firstly, when it comes to the leadership, I think it's kind of falling to the French and the British by default because they're the ones organizing all of these summits. So they're the ones who are doing all of the legwork. The diplomats are working overtime in Brussels, across the continent, and even abroad. I mean, you know all the stories about what's going on with the US and Canada right now, for example, and the Australians being slightly miffed about the submarine gate and how that's actually impacted their relationship with all of the allies. I mean, as you say, we're now on to the fifth or so summit relating to the security issue, the Ukraine issue, and the complete abdication of duty from the US. And I guess the fact that these are continuing and that there's not been any big explosive fallouts means that these are a success. And the fact that we keep building more and more towards some kind of coherent position on what's going to happen with Ukraine, what the Europeans are doing to secure the Ukrainian position. And on top of that, the Europeans pushing back quite hard against Trump's shenanigans, I guess you could say, is quite good. I mean, for example, yesterday we saw that this apparent SWIFT ban relaxation is definitely not going to happen, which was already a likelihood with the US deciding to just do it on their own. And the fact that
Even though they
Macron,
don't own Swift, Swift is based here in Belgium.
yeah, exactly. And it's a very European program that's key to a lot of international transactions. But the really interesting thing was that the Europeans and the 33 actors, so the NATO -3 plus the ambassadors from Turkey, Australia, and Canada, all decided that there isn't going to be a relaxation of sanctions on Russia. On top of the fact that this reassurance force is going to be put forward in Ukraine, it's a failure for the Trump foreign policy right now. So the first 100 days not only pissed off all the allies, but also isolated Trump's foreign policy, which we're probably going to hear more about from some weird leaked signal chat at some point in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously the reason that these summits have taken place in Paris and London is because they're being led by this Franco-British alliance, you could say, or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call it. But notably, they're also taking place there because they can't take place in Brussels, and that's because the two Brussels-based institutions, NATO and the European Union, are being bypassed here. I think the reason for bypassing NATO is obvious. It's an American dominated organization. And if they're trying to work against or around America, you can't have a NATO summit because America will be there.
Yeah.
The reason for bypassing the European Union is less clear to me, because you have everyone there is in the European Union except Norway, Turkey, the UK, and it's that UK component which is clearly the reason why this needs to go around the European Union. It's because of Brexit, because within the EU before 2020, the only two real military powers were France and Britain. Half of that left in 2020. And so the reason you have to have this outside of the EU, I think, has largely been driven by Brexit. However, you could have something being organized by the EU, in which the UK participates without being part of the EU. This already exists for things like Schengen, for instance. Switzerland, Norway, they're all in the Schengen area. You also have governing bodies for things that are not all EU members, just some, like the Eurozone, which has the
Mm.
Eurogroup of finance ministers running it. Why do you think that there's been no effort made for the European Union to try to coordinate this coalition of the willing, neither from the EU presidents, President von der Leyen or President Costa, nor from any of the prime ministers and national presidents?
Yeah. So it's one of those really interesting things where you have to have your feet or probably your hips deep in European politics because it's one of those topics that people don't quite understand, as you say, and it's quite complicated. So, first of all, foreign policy is always very complicated at the EU level because you usually have to have unanimity, you have to have everybody on the same page, you have to have everybody agreeing. And right now, that's not really possible because you have two member states that are very pro-Russian, and they are the two that were missing yesterday. So you have Hungary, you have Slovakia. And on top of that, you also have the issue where military isn't really, and security especially, isn't really a topic that the EU is very active in. It's becoming more active with Rearm EU and all of these programs that we're putting together, and the fact that there's more efforts being made to create some kind of, as the French are now running around showboating with, strategic autonomy from the US and Russia and China. But I think ultimately, one of the reasons, and the primary reason that it's being done in this very odd way is that we have some unreliable allies who aren't really working with us. They don't want to work with us. They don't really want to ally with us. They don't really want to engage with us. They're mostly frustrating proceedings. And in the case of Hungary, just trying to make sure that money keeps coming in from EU programs that they're not going to lose and send somewhere else. And on top of that, as you say in the NATO thing, you got the Americans who are just going to frustrate and prevent things. So now you've got a structure where it's basically outside of all things that we know. So this coalition of the willing, I've heard people call it, NATO minus three. I've heard people call it, the new NATO. I've heard people say it's the European Defense Alliance or the European Defense Program or Europe de la Défense, as we say it in French. So, I mean, it's a lot of these things, but ultimately it's that with Hungary and Slovakia, you can't trust them to not frustrate and block everything whenever they can. With the Americans, you can't trust them to not block everything they can at the NATO level, so you have to go around them and just try to figure stuff out. But it's important to add the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and the president of the Council, Antonio Costa, are both involved in all of these meetings and have been from the get-go. So there is clearly a European component inside of this.
Yeah, they're there, but as participants, right?
Yes.
Not as leaders. So they're kind of, taking notes, and anything that evolves into the funding area or anything that might be relevant to the EU, they say, "Hey guys, how about the European Union does that?" But they're not really, taking the initiative, right? And it seems to me you're right that there's two problems with the EU. One is Brexit, and two is the spoilers of Hungary and Slovakia within it. However, this coalition of the willing, or I know that's an unfortunate term because it's left from the Iraq
Yeah.
War, right? Definitely not popular in
Yeah.
France. So I'm not surprised they're not using it in France. But they haven't actually taken any binding decisions, right? I mean, if any of these things that they've discussed at these five summits so far were discussed instead here at the European Council with the invitees, Norway, UK, Turkey. There's nothing that they've done that Hungary could have vetoed or blocked. So I see that as I don't really see either reason as a compelling reason not to involve the EU. And then there's also, as you say, this idea out there among politicians and the public that the EU is like forbidden from getting involved in defense. That's just not true.
Yeah,
There are instruments in the European Union that give it the capability of being involved in defense. There's the defense coordination. There's the issue is that it's been a taboo to actually use it
yeah,
up till now, and it's never been used because of the neutral members, Ireland and Austria, the reticence, surrendering power to Brussels, this fear of the quote EU army, but it's all there and they're just not using it. So it seems unfortunate to me that they're trying to reinvent the wheel here by having these ad hoc summits and then not using what's available to them here in terms of
mm,
legislative infrastructure and in terms of coordination infrastructure that took a lot of time to set these things up in all the various treaties, and now they're just ignoring that they're there. What do you think?
So I don't think they're ignoring that they're there. So, for example, I personally believe that the Rearm EU program probably came out of one of the earlier summits that took place earlier, I think January or February, whenever it was. I mean, they were already working on this kind of thing, but I think it pushed it harder. And honestly, I know what you mean, and I understand the sentiment that it probably should have been included in the EU structures. But again, because it would likely. So here's the issue that I see happening. If it's connected to Ukraine in any way, shape, or form, as opposed to being a EU program, for example, Rearm EU or these, the famous Eurobonds that we've been hearing about for close to a decade now and all this, then what happens is you have the pro-Russian actors who will have a reason to start vetoing and cutting programs down, and we already have enough problems between the frugal and the spenders and all this kind of thing. So I think it probably wasn't the worst idea tactically to have these as a secondary set of meetings outside of the framework of the European Union, because it also provides cover for von der Leyen, Costa, and Callas to be able to do the work within the structures to actually build these things up.
To take
And
authorization from the ad hoc summit. So say the ad hoc summit asked us to do this, so we're going to do it.
not
But
necessarily, no.
constitutionally, that's a bit problematic because the council didn't ask them to do it, right?
No, of course, but if the majority of the council members are involved in this anyway, and they can
Mhm.
actually give the authorization to Costa to say, okay, we've discussed this externally, try and
Right.
see what you can make work of this. So I think it's not that they're taking authorization from these external summits because it's still being led, I think, majority by EU member states. I think, again, the only ones who aren't are Starmer, Zelensky, and maybe,
Turkey sometimes there.
yeah, Rutte or something, you know. But it's one of these things that it's also provides political cover because then, if you have Hungary who starts saying, oh, no, we don't want this at all, and then the council goes, okay, why? Because this has nothing to do with Ukraine. This is just us trying to bolster our defense.
Mhm.
And Viktor Orban's in some, pardon my French, some pretty deep shit right now in the polling.
Mm.
So it's giving them cover to like sort of force the issues in a way that's actually advantageous to the EU without involving the really disruptive actors who are going to continuously try to attack. And of
It-
course, it helps us boost our raison d'être when it comes to a lot of these defense issues. And from the French point of view, it helps push strategic autonomy in a positive direction, I think.
It's interesting too that Orban has been much more proactive about vetoing the things having to do with Ukraine
Yeah,
than the things just purely having to do with EU rearmament or EU defense. That the things that he's really needed convincing on, or that they've had to go around him on, are specifically things that he thinks prolong the Ukraine war. But
yeah,
he's been less vocally opposed to EU rearmament. He's saying the same general kinds of things that Maloney is saying, also that
yeah.
it's a power grab by the EU. This is what Le Pen has been saying in France, but hasn't really been standing in the way of it. In that vein, I wanted to talk to you about France's leadership role here. By the way, I'll just say to our viewers, welcome in case you're just joining. If you want to ask us a question, you can type us in the bottom, and
Yeah.
we can answer it at the end of the chat. So, France, you're leading this charge along with the UK. I think France is having a bit of an I told you so moment right now because for decades, France has been warning about Europe being too dependent on the United States.
Yeah.
This was the Gaullist line. For a long time, France had an arm's length relationship with NATO. They've never allowed any American bases on French soil. And they've said to the other Europeans, you are becoming too dependent on the US, and this can come back to bite us in the ass someday. And here we are, it's biting us in the ass. What do you think about France's I told you so moment? And why do you think people, the other Europeans, particularly in Eastern EU and Germany, in the UK, in the Nordics, didn't listen to France with these warnings over all these years?
So, I mean, it's one of those really odd things because, I mean, I'm one of those people who have been doing victory laps for a little while now. Because, to be honest, it's one of these things where we were always talking about this and we were always saying, look, we're too dependent. We're too dependent on Russia for energy, China for industry, the US for defense, etc., etc. And usually the response you always got, and I'm getting this from people who are now full-throated European Gaullists all the way up and down the corridors of Brussels is yeah, but you know, you French just want to start selling us your products. All you
Exactly.
want to do is
Exactly.
boost yourself. You're just trying to profit, nya nya nya, blah blah blah. And at that point, you always kind of just like mentally switched off because it was the same argument as, oh, the only reason you want linguistic plurality in the EU is because you want everybody to speak French eventually, nya nya nya, blah blah blah. And it's it's the kind of arguments that is you kind of stop caring and you zone
Mm.
out. But it's not so much of a I told you so moment, I would say, because it's not necessarily like we've not been trying to push this at the European level for a while now. I mean, like you go back and listen to the old Macron speeches at the Sorbonne, so the one in 2017 and the one in 2021. I mean, Macron's been saying that we need to have more industry in Europe because not only is it good for defense, but it's good for jobs, it's good for tax income, it's good for making sure that we have specialities that remain in Europe, etc., etc. And this is something that's very important, and we got lost a bit in the whole, or the French are just trying to French, and you know. But
France is going to France.
France is gonna France. But the reality is that for the most part, we're happy that people are taking this seriously because we've been saying this forever. I mean, I think one of the first things I saw when all of this started kicking off and Trump started throwing us under a bus is I saw a guy who I remember was a hardcore like transatlanticist tweet out, "Ah, de Gaulle was right." And
Yes, I've seen that a lot.
while it makes me laugh every single time I see it, it's it's true that we in France benefit from a lot of the positions that people kind of mocked us for. Nuclear energy spared us a lot of trouble when it came to the post-Ukraine invasion energy issues. It prevented us from having to, eat dirt like Germany did when they had to deal with the Nord Stream fallout and all of these situations. It's allowed us to maintain the ability to increase our military production very rapidly and also increase our capacity. And on top of this, it's allowed us to be able to actually support other actors in the EU to actually find a way out. So, ultimately being more independent and sort of being l'enfant terrible of the European Union has basically saved us a lot of trouble. And this is sort of something that I've discussed previously as well, in that, one issue that people have right now when it comes to the rearmament, and while Europeans are listening to us more, one issue that we have is people are still concerned about the bigger member states taking control of all of the production. So, you have the big member states. You have France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Poland who produce a lot of weaponry and a lot of equipment. And there's concerns that they could take over all of the issue, all of the development and just profit from the fact that we're rearming. But my position, I think the general position in France is that this isn't necessarily smart because what you need to do is encourage these people to increase their production
Mhm.
while using funds like Rearm EU, which is what it's intended to do, to boost the production of military weaponry in smaller member states. I mean, for example, you have the SCAR being produced in Belgium, you have HK producing weapons in Austria, you have the Romanians producing other weaponry too. And we need to come to a point where, we're all producing equipment, we're all producing weaponry, and we're actually ensuring that we're not dependent on the US.
Yeah, it like you say, it seems to me that France was a bit of an imperfect messenger here, in that
Yeah,
they always got this response that, well, of course you don't want us to buy American weapons, you want us to buy your weapons.
yeah,
And reminiscent of the, of course you don't want us to speak English, you want us to speak your language.
yeah,
Um, I think there's a bit of Francophobia that's been involved in that over the years,
yeah,
because this element of, oh, you can't argue for European military sovereignty because you're a big country that produces a lot of military equipment. Well, who else would have the authority to make this argument? I mean, you wanted Germany to make this argument while it wasn't spending anything on its military. You
yeah.
wanted Italy to make this argument. You wanted Slovenia to make this argument. I always wondered. I mean, I guess the UK might have had more credibility if they saw the need to be arguing for this because of the so-called special relationship. Um, but do you think that maybe French politicians could have approached this argument a little more humbly over the years? I mean, is there some blame to put at Paris's door for not being able to sell this message to Europe? And maybe if they had changed their approach, maybe if they had changed some of this obsession over
Mm.
the language issue, people might have been more willing to listen to them.
I mean, I think the issue is always, it's not just the person receiving the message, it's also the person conveying the message. I mean, this is always a case. As comms experts, we know this. If you're not communicating properly, then, or if your communication strategy isn't working, change the strategy, right? But the issue also, I mean, it doesn't help that, in France we have very strong presidents usually, and either they have control in the parliament or the assembly, or they don't, and this can change the dynamics. So, for example, if you had, I mean, not even just that. It's just like, for example, one of our key messages was Chirac and Sarkozy, and Sarkozy was an unhinged cannonball. I mean, that guy made the argument. Someone told him, "Yeah, but we don't want to buy." I think the quote was, "We don't want to buy your weapons because we want to have more availability." And Sarkozy said something like, "Okay, then go pick up some Italian rocks and throw them at whoever." And it's like, you hear this stuff and you think to yourself, what the hell is going through your head? It is something that the French kind of started doing a bit more recently. I mean, it also helped that you had a president in Macron who at least understood a bit how the other member states and leaders and other cultural actors function, because I think he was one of the few presidents that we've had who actually spent substantial time in the US, in English speaking countries abroad, etc., etc. So, and his cultural sensitivities helped quite a lot on this too, and it
Yeah,
was also helped.
I was going to say it would probably surprise a lot of people, particularly in France. But I think when it comes to France's relationship with Europe, Macron is probably the least arrogant French president that there has
Yeah,
been in a long time, because he actually engaged with Europe. Hollande's style may have not seemed overly arrogant, but where was he? I mean, he just didn't even deign to engage in these
no.
issues, right?
And he was always playing a bit more the domestic side of politics because,
Yeah.
admittedly, it was a financial crisis. There was a lot of shit hitting the fan for several years. But really, he was always, I would say he was more Jupiterian than Macron was on the international stage, where sometimes Holland, aside from looking mildly gormless quite often, he would also look down his nose at people, and it would always rub people the wrong way. I mean, I'm thinking back to his relationship with his Greek counterparts, which was borderline catastrophic at times, because he would constantly tell them, "Well, you guys can't handle," well, not in as many words, but he would give the message, "You guys can't handle your economy. Why are you complaining when we try to help you?" You know? And it was always this weird thing. But also, let's be fair, it helps that, we've Macron spent very little time with Merkel. And then with the lack of this very austere, very, let's say, self-centered German leadership, and helped by the chaos with Scholz's circus of friends and former politicians, it became easier for Macron to work around the Germans and speak with the Italians, the Spanish, the Scandies, the Benelux. And to be honest, that helped with the messaging a lot, alongside his cultural sensitivity, alongside the fact that he knew how to work with these people, and the fact that, to be honest, Macron's just a really fucking good diplomat when you think about it.
Well, speaking of Macron, it's been interesting to me that this whole situation, that the inauguration of Donald Trump has really revived Macron's political fortunes.
Yeah,
He was really looking like a complete lame duck as of the end of last year because of all of the electoral shenanigans last year and his situation in the Assemblée Nationale. Now he's found kind of, I think, a renewed raison d'etre on the international stage. And you see that actually translating into polling numbers in
yeah,
France, where at the moment he's at levels rarely seen by a French president in terms of approval. In other countries, this wouldn't look so high, but in France, where people
yeah.
like to complain, the approval numbers are never very high for any president. Why do you think we're having this Trump effect on some of the centrist leaders' popularity? It isn't just Macron. Of course, we saw the same thing happen with the Liberals in Canada. We saw with, I think, Merz since the election. Is this here to stay? Is this little Trump bounce for Macron and others going to be permanent? And is it what's driving it? Is it actually a form of European nationalism or anti-Americanism that's driving it?
I mean, it's possible. I see his. I don't want to say that Europeans would take an anti-American position because I mean, look, we we love you guys. You're the weird cousins across the ocean. You make stupid decisions sometimes, but we forgive you like we forgive any weird cousin that we have. But no, it's more. I mean, first of all, let's quickly run through the numbers. So
I would say with that
Macron,
analogy, you want them to be weird cousins and not weird fathers, right?
it
That's
helps.
the essence of where Europe wants the relationship right now.
It helps exactly, and we want to be on equal footing because, to be honest, like we have the comparative power when we, admittedly get our shit together. But so I mean, Macron already he got a 6.37% bounce in the polling numbers, so he's gone up to 37%. Now, again, that doesn't sound very high to people. However, I think at the same period of time, François Hollande was sitting at 21%. Sarkozy was somewhere in the 28% region. So in a
It's very
country
high
where
by
you
French
have
standards, yeah.
exactly when in a country where you've got a lot of opposition forces that will absolutely ransack the president, and then 20 years later everybody's like, well, the president he was okay, he was pretty good, and then they always end up with like a polling number way higher, like 10, 20 years later. And this was mostly done through a boost in his reaction to the not only the Trump situation where people slowly start to realize that actually maybe we don't have it so bad with this guy. On top of the fact that he's standing up for Europe and France and actually looking out for us against a man who is hell bent on making our lives hell. And on top of that, the his reaction to the Ukraine situation, trying to fix the issues at hand. And this is very important because so not only do you have the fact that Macron's kind of stepped up to lead to the role that he's best at, and I've always said that I could very much see Macron eventually being the president of the commission at some point or council, considering the fact that he has this very natural gravitas for international and European politics.
But
It
that's probably the problem in terms of the council wanting to appoint him. He's too good.
Yeah, he's too good. And also, there's a very big hesitance to actually put a French person in position because we're
Yeah.
seen again as l'enfant terrible of the European Union, despite the fact that, again, we were kind of right about everything for the last 7, 8 years. Sorry, not sorry. But it also doesn't help that the far right are taking a beating in the polling because they all link themselves too closely to Trump and the far right. I mean, look, you could probably make a connection. Bardella lost 1%. I think it's the first time that he's taken a big hit after having a bit of a high earlier this year, with the Trump bounce that ended up being a bit of a toxic chalice. And you've even seen that the potential successor to Emmanuel Macron, Edouard Philippe, has actually now equaled Marine Le Pen in the polling as the second most popular politician at around 37%, knowing that Marine Le Pen is likely to actually be banned from running in the next elections, which is another whole situation related to her embezzlement and her party shenanigans in the European Parliament. But ultimately, I think Macron is benefiting from the fact that he just stuck to his guns. And as one of the readers here are saying, he's getting some recognition for pushing a goalless European military organization for years, such as Europe de la Défense, a coherent European military action, which is also being backed by everybody's favorite missed opportunity for a strong European leader, Mario Draghi, who gave us the famous Draghi report that the Germans famously killed in less than 3 hours. So, I mean, it's complicated when it comes to Macron because again, his domestically he's always going to struggle, but he also benefits from just now that he's in his second quinquennat. Now that he can't run for the next elections, even if he can technically legally run for the elections in 2032, it's he can just go for it and just run through brick walls at this stage because he doesn't need to worry about losing the next election.
Yeah. We've had a lot of questions and comments coming in, so I want to go
Yeah,
to those in a bit. But sticking with this topic, one last thing we can talk about is, did you see Mark Carney's speech yesterday?
yeah,
Uh, so, for anyone who hasn't seen it, the Prime Minister of Canada had a speech last night saying Canada's relationship with the United States is over. Period. It
yeah.
was so clear, so strong, basically saying that's not to say that Canada will not have any relationship with the US. It's saying the relationship that Canada has had with the US up to this point is over. It is dead, and they need to reevaluate everything going forward. And it struck me that no European leader has said that. Everyone's still treating this like a temporary affliction that's going to pass. No one will say that the United States is no longer an ally of Europe. It strikes me that the person that's the leader or leader in waiting that's come the closest to saying anything like this is Friedrich Merz in Germany, but he's not even chancellor yet.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because both Carney and Merz were speaking in the context of elections. So does it take elections for people to be bold and say the truth here? Do you think that the strategy that the European leaders are using right now, which is to downplay the collapse of the transatlantic alliance, to still be talking about America as an ally, is that just necessary to keep the peace for diplomatic reasons, or are they really making a strategic mistake here by saying something that's so disconnected from what their citizens can see is the reality here
Hmm.
on planet Earth?
So I think so. Firstly, it's a slightly different situation because, the Americans keep making these very, very aggressive and very, I would say, emotionally unstable statements about annexing Canada, and they seem to be attempting to bully the Canadians. So I think in that case, if you had the Americans doing the same to the French, we would probably say exactly the same thing, aside from also probably telling Trump to go do one, It's one of these things where, sure, the elections are helping, and, Merz is also trying very, very, very hard to differentiate himself from Scholz, because Scholz did, I mean, it's the whole Zeitenwende curse, right? It's like we made this big announcement about rearming Germany and fixing the mistakes of the past. And you're putting 50% of the funding to replace the bullets that got too moldy because they were left in a fucking shack for 40 years. It's this kind of thing where Merz is trying to differentiate himself from the previous German leadership. Carney's trying to do the same thing. And when it comes to the Europeans, it may seem like they're maybe going softly, softly with the Americans, but the reality is, I think it's sort of a fait accompli that the Americans aren't really going to have our back. It's why the Americans, despite or the American government, I should say, because a lot of Americans send me messages through the French dispatch saying, well, it's not all of us. We like you guys. We really like France. How can I move there? What's the taxes like, etc., etc. And basically, it's this idea where we've kind of accepted that this is happening, or at least for the next 4 years. And there's a significant subsection of the American population that really has this weird far right MAGA Tea Party brainworm thing going on. That's meaning that they just don't really get what's going on, and they just keep listening to people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who I'm convinced is as high on ketamine as Elon Musk half the time. But if you look at the symbolism of the decisions being taken and the actions being taken and what's being said, I don't think there's really any doubt about the fact that the Americans aren't going to have our back. You've got everybody saying, okay, we need to do this on our own. They're not our friends. You've got the Americans not being invited to
Well, but I
anything.
don't think people are saying they're not our friends, right? That's the issue. No one's saying that.
Oh no, this is being said in the.
Quietly, I mean, but not publicly. I mean,
Oh
this
no,
is
this was
what,
being
of
said
course, if
publicly in
I'm
the
in a briefing
Assemblée.
with the European diplomats here, they'll say that, but they'll never say it publicly.
Oh, but this was being said in the Assemblée Nationale, for example. Like there were speeches about how the Americans just aren't our friends anymore. We need to do this. Like this
But why
is
doesn't Macron say it?
probably because Macron, as the president, is the chief diplomat. So he's the one, and because he's the president in or the head of state in Europe that's the closest to Trump, there's probably a tactical view that he has to be the one who sort of continues to be the bridge between the Europeans and the Americans, particularly Zelensky and the Americans. And the reality is that, some presidents. I mean, okay, again, Macron doesn't really care anymore because he's not exactly legacy shopping because his legacy's here already. He was right the whole time and people should have listened to him. But some presidents don't necessarily mind being seen as the guy sucking up to the Americans because they're the ones who have to do it because they're the only ones who can,
Mm.
in my view. Whereas you're going to see once once the Merz government is put in place, I can guarantee you're going to see a trip between Merz and Trump where they're shaking hands and doing all this nonsense. And saying that we don't need the Americans, they're not our friends, and not going to come and save us, which is a message that has been said repeatedly by heads of states. I don't have the names in mind, but it's being transmitted, or at least by foreign ministers and all these people. The reality is that I think that they've accepted that this is the case, and they may not be saying it as loudly as Carney, which is a shame in my opinion. But the Americans aren't also talking about invading Europe yet.
In a way, they are with
Yeah.
Greenland. I mean, it's notable that Mette
No,
Frederiksen
you're
has
right.
been
You're
very
right,
muted
actually.
in her
Yes.
statements, right? So
Yeah.
she's been a little like she's gone a little further this week because of the Usha Vance and now JD Vance visit happening today. But for the most part, and I even heard that she was telling other European leaders to be quiet. And that she didn't want them speaking on Denmark's behalf, trying to rile things up. They were really hoping that I think that Trump would forget about this, that he would like get distracted by a shiny
Yeah.
object and move on. That clearly did that strategy didn't work, right? I mean, I think the Greenland thing shows that this strategy of trying to placate Trump and smiling and playing nice, it didn't work, right?
Yeah.
And I'm really curious about that first meeting when Friedrich Merz goes to Washington. Yes, I mean, he'll go, he'll shake Trump's hands, but will he be smiling and jokey like Macron and Starmer were in their visits? I mean, both Macron and Starmer looked like everything was normal, right? They were
Yeah.
pretending that this relationship is great. I don't, I think, I'm curious to see what he does, but I don't think Friedrich Merz is going to do that. I think he's going to have a stern German face when he sits
Yeah.
there in the Oval Office, and it'll be a bit more similar probably to Merkel's meeting with Donald Trump. And I think that's what citizens want to see. I don't think European citizens want to see Macron sitting in that chair, joking with Trump, grabbing his hand. Ah, ha, ha. There's all this reading of, oh, he's out masculinitying him with his arm movements. And
Oh, all those
I
things.
mean,
Yeah, I remember.
just have a stern face. I think that's what
Yeah.
Europeans want.
But
And as you say, with the speaking for the foreign policy, I mean, the Canadian Prime Minister, I mean, I guess it's the King Charles that actually represents the statecraft of Canada, but the
yeah.
people historically would have looked to the Prime Minister of Canada also to be that diplomatic face. Clearly, Mark Carney has made a different decision.
Yeah.
I bet European leaders will be very curious the outcome of that election in Canada and to see, did this work for Mark Carney? And if it did, maybe they'll start getting more bold here.
Yeah. And I mean, so just to go back on the point, we also need to remember that Macron was being very jerky with Trump while correcting him and putting him back in his place several times. And it's one of these things that, again, it happened at a time when you also have the French foreign minister, so Jean-Noël Barrot, who also said that if Denmark triggered Article 5 because the US was getting a bit handsy with Greenland, then the French would be sending troops over there.
The only country I
So,
think to say that, actually.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's all part of a very bad. delicate diplomatic balancing act in general because it's something that, yeah, you have to have the stake and you have to sort of stand up to it. But if Macron's got the personal relationship again, then that's important. And it's also, I mean, I hesitate to say there's a strategy in the White House right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if Trump also uses his flying monkeys like Pete Hegseth and the circus to do something similar and, play the bad cops to him being like, oh, we can deal, blah, blah, blah. Even though we've seen in Russia that the art of the deal is pretty dead right now.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, we're just about out of time, but I want to take some of the questions that have come in. Most of these are comments, which I won't read out because you guys can see the viewers can see them as well. So feel free to read those comments for yourselves. But there's a question here from Andrea Shiu. Can you speak to some of the security concerns for the EU and France coming out of this week's mind-numbing Signalgate revelations? How would you say people in France are feeling about Signalgate?
I mean, in all of my conversations in France and also in Brussels, to be honest, people are just making fun of the Americans. Really, it's a very, or mostly the team, to be honest, because the issue is we already had the Signal issue previously, where the head of Signal was being arrested, where it was shown that it was being used for all of these very illegal activities and some very, very dark stuff. And the reality is, all it's really done is kind of tarnish the American government's reputation even more, to be honest. But it's also raised some questions about, okay, are our leaders doing this? Since it's illegal over there for them to be deleting their messages on, classified American activity and the fact that they're very much not being serious, what's happening here in Brussels? Because, I was in a conversation with someone from the council a few days ago talking about the fact that even if some people use Signal and they tend not to because they prefer WhatsApp, they have an obligation to keep their messages
Yeah,
after the fact because it's a legal requirement for reporting, at
I've
least
had
in
I've had the exact same conversation. Yeah.
exactly. So it's created this. I think it's slightly raised awareness of the fact that some people can behave in very janky manners, and especially in France with the ongoing. Let's say, court case with Marine Le Pen and the Rassemblement National's embezzlement and shady behavior, which may or may not have involved potential future presidential candidate Jordan Bardella falsifying information. It's bringing lots of questions regarding the sanctity of politics in France, even in Europe, and how politicians are allowed to behave in general.
Mm. And I think there's always this leadership question that, Donald Trump gives permission to leaders around the world to lower their standards, to get away with things. And if politicians on the far right here in Europe, they obviously want to emulate Donald Trump, if they see, oh, look, you don't need to follow any rules, you can break the law and just refuse to comply with judicial rulings. I think that's coming up in the next month, that type of constitutional crisis in the United States. But that other politicians look to that as an example and say, well, they're not following it. I won't follow the rules or standards either. The other question about so there's the fact that they were on Signal with this war planning, clearly confidential information,
Yeah.
but also what JD Vance said about Europe got some attention here. I think it wasn't so much that this is new information. It's very similar to what he said in his Munich speech to their face. But it shows he has this kind of weird obsession with Europe. I mean, all kinds of countries use the Suez Canal to ship
Yeah.
goods. China, India, Saudi Arabia was benefited by this launch, obviously. Why focus on Europe? I mean, it's like nobody was talking about Europe, and then JD Vance brings it into the conversation. And then Pete Hegseth, clearly looking for a way to suck up to the vice president. Yeah, yeah, that's right. I hate the Europeans too. It shows that Pete Hegseth knows that this is an issue that really gets JD Vance very animated, and he's trying to join in. Yeah, that's right, boss. They
Yeah.
suck. And so I think that's what I mean. It's not new information, but it showed the degree to which JD Vance seems to have this almost visceral hatred for Europe. And that sparked a lot of conversation here about why that is, what Europe represents to him, that
Yeah.
he dislikes it so much. What do you think about that?
It's very see, there's this problem when you try to analyze anything that the MAGA guys try to do, in that you can never tell if they're doing it because they know that it helps them with their popular base, or the Elon Musk fanboys, or all of these random people who they think are their core electorates. I mean, for example, it's why JD Vance, a guy who grew up in like a city, pretends to have been this sort of the earth hillbilly and all this nonsense,
Yeah,
like. But I mean, Hegseth seemed like he was trying to say, yeah, you're right, boss. However, we still need the Europeans, so let's figure that out later and do all this nonsense, right? But with JD Vance, I think that it's because I don't think he really necessarily knows what he's doing, and he's just kind of trying to sort of repeat the highs of what was going on during the election campaign because he thinks that this plays well. Like his whole like the whole weird post of him like shooting a gun yesterday or something, where he was talking about sending freedom seeds down range and all this nonsense, shows that he doesn't really quite understand the severity of like military use and military action, right? But on the European front, I think it's this idea that I think the Trump administration may realize that they really overplayed their hand and think that they can potentially bully their way out of this. Because, put it this way, if this thing happens, you have the biggest market in the world, bigger than China, if I'm not wrong with the numbers, where I need to double check that, which would stop buying American weaponry, which would start probably outproducing the Americans with a more streamlined process, with a military that's going to get more and more powerful, that's not going to need the Americans. And while the Americans are always talking about, or this American government, sorry, I need to keep correcting myself on that. While the current American government keeps saying, "Oh, we need the Europeans to do their own job, we're not the world police, etc., nya nya nya," they're going to realize that basically getting rid of your biggest customer is going to have a big impact on your bottom line and your ability to actually support your own state. Because the military industrial complex is huge in the US. I think it's the biggest
yeah,
industry by far. It's like the version of the automotive industry here in Europe, right? And the problem is that when they have less customers, what do you do? Because you're not going to want to start selling all your high-tech weaponry to China and Russia. And those are the only
exactly.
major markets that would remain.
And this is why, when Pete Hegseth was here at the defense ministers meeting at NATO, and he was saying, no more reliance. We want Europe to be independent. No, you don't. You want Europe to keep supporting the American military industrial complex, because that complex can't exist without those European purchases. And
Yeah,
what the United States has always wanted was simply for the Europeans to spend more, but not to be more in control, not to
yeah,
develop their own command and control structure. They've resisted European efforts to do that for a long time. And I think what the Trump administration is learning here is that if you simultaneously ask the Europeans to spend more, they're now doing it. But if you do that in this nasty, aggressive way, then the Europeans are going to spend more, but they're not going to buy it from you. And you saw that the stock prices drop for the military arms producers in the US. In as soon as Trump said that comment in the Oval Office, where he said, maybe we won't make very good weapons
yeah,
to Europeans because they might not be our allies eventually. Like, what a businessman! What a businessman! I want to
yeah,
wrap it up soon, but I want to take this one more question that's come in from KH Hardy. We touched upon this before, but maybe to go into it in more detail. Question is, Europe must resolve the problem of Hungary and finally somehow get Italy on board with the security outlook. What's the outlook on this? Also, the Russian funds, will those be used to help Ukraine? Those are the frozen Russian assets. On the
yeah,
frozen Russian assets, I'm not sensing any movement on that at the
yeah,
moment. Kaya Kallas has been trying to push this, but it's not really going anywhere. I think there's two reasons for that. They are really, really concerned about the legal implications of that, particularly
yeah,
Belgium, where the funds are. They're worried for two reasons: that it would be deemed illegal under international law to take the assets that have been frozen, that it's one thing to use the interest from those assets, but to use the assets themselves wouldn't survive a challenge under international law. And that is what the EU is still, in theory, trying to uphold. And the other is that it would spook investors so much that the Europe would lose investment, because investors would say, "Oh, I'm not going to invest in Europe because all of a sudden they can take my money." and just freeze it and take it away from me. So I don't see that moving. On the issue of Orban, there's been talk, suggestions about ending unanimity requirements in the council for a very long time. It was a recommendation from the citizens in the Conference on the Future of Europe a couple years ago. I believe it was in the Draghi report, even as well, certainly in the
Yeah.
Letta report. Why is this not happening still? What's your take? Because it is still being resisted. As much as all the countries grumble about Orban vetoing, when you talk to the
Yeah.
Swedes, when you talk to the Poles, they are not, they will die in the dirt before they end that unanimity requirement.
Yeah, I so on that point, it's a chicken and the egg situation really, or it's like catch-22. So basically, to end unanimity at the council level when it comes to all of these foreign affairs topics, the reality is you need unanimity to change the treaties. And who is going to avoid changing the treaties to reduce their own power? It's going to be Viktor Orban and the Slovaks and all these people. So it's really a big issue, and it's one of the reasons why people are mostly hoping that Orban loses the next election,
Mm.
because otherwise it's going to get it gets messy, and it's just not going to happen. But yeah, I mean, like Dave said, when it comes to the Russian financing, I mean, that is a legal quagmire. I mean, and nobody even knows where that would end up, to be honest. Like, I've had people try to map that out, and nobody really knows how dangerous it goes. And I think we'd all prefer that that did happen and that this financing was being used. But it gets very, very messy. And I mean, on the point of Italy, and just taking the points from Kieran O'Driscoll there at the bottom, I think Italy is going to probably take a similar, not a similar position to Ireland, but I can imagine what Italy would do is they would take defensive military forces, but they would be very hesitant to use them, at least under Meloni, which is understandable considering her positions and despite the fact that she's quite pro-Ukraine. I mean, I think any Italian president or prime minister, sorry, what I'm talking about, any Italian prime minister who would send Italian troops to fight Russia would probably lose the next election very quickly.
Mm.
And it would probably trigger elections very quick. It would bring down the government. It would be even worse than the disaster that took down Draghi, to be
Yeah,
honest.
you look at the polling numbers in Italy, and Maloney is not wrong about this. The Italians are some of the least supportive of increasing
Yeah,
military action, least supportive of helping Ukraine in all of Europe.
yeah.
And that may be because they feel so remote from Russia, protected by the Alps, but that's the reality. I know I said that was going to be the last question, but one last one because I think it was a good sum up question from Kieran O'Driscoll in Ireland. He says, in Ireland, there would be a wariness of the militarization of the EU. That's a position held due to our own tradition of military neutrality and geography. What's the key argument here to bring those people along in the EU who share this view? And on that, I would go back to our point about Mark Carney and the utility of European leaders speaking honestly to
Yeah.
Europeans about what's going on right now. That's the reason, right? Because, yes, okay, you can say they need to be diplomatic. They shouldn't inflame the situation by saying that the relationship with the United States will be forever changed and that the relationship is over and using this kind of strong language. But how else are you going to get Europeans on board here? People are going to have to make sacrifices. Europe is going to have to go onto a war footing. And if European leaders are still talking like everything's fine, that the US is still an ally, oh, we just need to wait this out, and in 4 years there'll be an
Mhm.
election. I mean, if they think there's going to be a normal election in 2 and 4 years, I think there's plenty of people who don't think that's going to happen. But if you just act like, oh, just a temporary blip, don't worry, we're still allies, then of course Europeans aren't going to support rearmament. This is the problem with the European politicians right now not being honest with citizens and talking about the reality right now as if we're in this parallel universe where the US is still an ally and everything is fine. That's why I would say it's really necessary to talk like Mark Carney here in Europe.
Mm.
What do you think? Do you think there needs to be more honest conversation with Europeans in order to get the Italians, the Irish, the more reticent Europeans on board with this?
And I think a part of that is true. So, I mean, most of what you said is true. It's very much a case of that we need to make people understand of what's actually going to come down the line. I mean, people. don't understand how bad things can get. It's why, for
Right.
example, in Belgium, they just announced that people should have 72 hours of stockpile of food and water to make sure that they can actually get through the initial stages of a
And
potential war.
people freaked out.
And people freaked out. It
And it
went like
shows the
people's
citizens don't
reactions.
understand what's happening. If they freak
Yeah.
out over that, clearly the message isn't being communicated that we're in an extremely volatile situation, right?
Yeah, and it's also a case of, it also highlights that people, and this is why I think it's important that we have publications like the Gulf Stream Blues, the French Dispatch actually explaining this to people, because people do need to understand what's going on. And I think it's important to be honest with people and make sure that while we're not scaremongering, we're telling them what's what. But I also think that, I mean, Ireland has a very interesting position because, I mean, on one part, and this would actually make a pretty interesting roundtable with Kieran O'Driscoll, actually, because he's quite good on this and is a good friend of the French Dispatch and has written for me in the past. Ireland has an interesting position geographically, where it's sort of sandwiched between the US and the UK. It's on the outer periphery of the European Union. And historically, they have a very, or I mean, at least the way I've perceived this and the way I've always heard this, a very anti-military, anti-imperialist position, which is why it's quite easy, I think, for some people, like certain MEPs that I won't name because they'll probably try to sue me like they try to sue every fucking journalist who talks about them, making the case that, this militarized European Union is an imperialist project, like really the true peace bringers are Russia, blah, 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 blah. And I think that one thing that needs to be done is not necessarily for more time to pass, but there almost needs to be some kind of disconnection between the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist mentality in Irish politics, which is, considering the history of the island, entirely justified, and the idea of the fact that we need a stronger military. We need to have the capability in Europe to actually fight with each other, to fight for ourselves and for each other, I mean, sorry. And a part of this is also making it clear to the Irish that also need to they do need to step up to the plate, and there needs to be a bit of a tough discussion, I think, between all of us, where we need to say, guys, like especially to the Austrians. I mean, the Austrians, holy Jesus Christ! I mean, this kind of stuff, those guys wind me up to no end. But the with Ireland, we need to have a discussion that takes into consideration the historical and the cultural aspects there, while also making sure that they understand that we need them to have our back. You know?
Yeah. Yeah, because this is a big preoccupation in Ireland, as you say. But I think, there's almost a re-education needed here. Europeans need to, A, understand how controlled they are by the United States, by this military protectorate. Then the first step is admitting you have a problem. Then step two, you need to make sure Europeans understand that the United States
Yeah.
has changed fundamentally and it's never going back. This is what America is now. It cannot be relied upon and it is not an ally. And then third step, you have to say, okay, because of that, now you understand how owned you are by the United States. Now you understand how dangerous the United States is. So now you understand that you need to make sacrifices in order to build Europe's defense so that Europe can defend itself without American aid, and that
Yeah.
even in the most extreme imagining of future events, defend itself from the United States. But without those first two steps, without making Europeans understand how owned they are and how dangerous the United States is, they will never accept step three, which is that they need to make sacrifices and be on a war footing. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, also at this stage, we may as well start handing out copies of de Gaulle's books because, I mean, for the sake of understanding, I mean, been a long-term preoccupation of several major politicians across Europe. I think even Adenauer was also saying, like, we don't want to be attached to the Americans when he was speaking to de Gaulle, but we kind of have to because right now we can't do otherwise.
Right.
And the problem is that's the message that kind of clung to the German and European psyche for so long that it's going to take time to come out.
Well,
But it's going to be a tough effort. But this is where publications like ours, the work of the Commission, the media cycle or the media environment in Brussels is going to be so important in actually making sure that people understand what's actually going on and that we're not doing this because we want to send like 17-year-old Jean-Jacques to fight in Vladivostok or something, but it's because we want to make sure that these kids aren't being put in a position where they'll have to go to war
right.
or that they will have to live under occupation or that they'll live in a dangerous world because
Yeah,
ultimately, and okay, this may be my goalless preoccupation here, but it's very much if we don't have a strong military, we won't be safe, and if we're not safe, we can't live good lives. And that's the
exactly.
simple message we need to explain to people.
Yeah, that the point is actually not to start a war, but to avoid a war. It's this
Yeah.
peace through strength mantra that the EU is having. Look, it's a depressing place to end, but it is at least a call for action. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
what we've settled on here is Europeans need to understand what's happening, and we all need to do our part to explain to Europeans what's happening right now and why this type
Yeah.
of action is needed, because especially in certain countries in Europe, it is a tough sell. So everybody go out there and do your part. Thank you so much again for talking with me here. We've gone a
No,
full
thank you.
hour.
Thank you.
That's a this is a record for my Substack lives for the length, and we could go on talking, right?
Yeah, of
It's
course.
fascinating stuff to talk about. So we should definitely do it again.
No,
But
for
we'll give
sure.
the viewers a break. Thanks for sticking with us for the past hour. I wish you all an excellent weekend, and we'll see what's coming next. Take care.
Yes. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye bye.